Hey, I know it's another parade day, so those of you that struggle to make it through traffic, we understand that with being a downtown church, that's part of our calling. We understand there are challenges that come with that, and we still think it's worth it, so thanks for braving that. I only assume we might get some emails like, hey, I tried to come, couldn't get there, and so anyway, that's our story. I am glad to be back here with you. We had an amazing time in Uganda. There's 14 of us that went. So we're still unpacking and processing some of that stuff ourselves. Some of us are literally still unpacking. Others of us are just unpacking our experiences. But let me just tell you this. The church, sometimes you enter into a partnership like we did, and we're like, we're going to go over and help this struggling church. We're going to really prop them up a bit, and that was not the case. I think they'll be able to help us perhaps more than we were able to help them. The church began in 1994. The church is already running 2,000 people, full capacity, 4 services, 500 each. Every chair plus is taken. They literally spend every Friday night in an overnight prayer service from, say, 10 in the evening till 7 in the morning. I know all of you would show up on Friday evenings for us to do that, although that would be incredible. They've got a big staff. They started a school 2 years ago, 560 students in the school. These kids are learning about Jesus, and man, it was incredible. And at the same time, you can easily see how Epic's going to fit into their story. They already get radio shows out to the masses there in the area. They are doing TV things, and they're trying to purchase their own radio station right now. And so I think there's lots of roles for us to play. And I think what God has shown me above all else maybe in this partnership is that by what we can leverage here and the influence that they have there, I really think we can, through them, reach the entire country of Uganda. I don't doubt that at all. They do 300 conferences a year already for other churches in Uganda. They have 40 branches of their church throughout villages and all around the area. And so we were the ones taking notes, not them. And so it left me, especially going with today's message, it just left me that thought, Ben, if you ever have faith that's too small, and just remember this, and they're doing, so often we go, well, you got to have this to do that, and you got to have this resource to do that kind of a thing. And it just kind of blew my mind that a lot of the things that we think we have to have, they don't have, and they're blowing and going and seeing some pretty incredible things happen. But glad to be here this morning. There is one word that I pray for more than any other word, whatever I'm praying for. The same word is the word I would use to describe what I saw all over United Christian Center Church in Kampala, Uganda. It's this word that I pray for my marriage more than any other word. It's the word that I pray for my kids more than any other word. I believe this word is how Abraham and Sarah had kids when they were really, really old, 100 for him, 90 for her. I think it's this word that allowed Moses to lead 2 million or so Israelites out of Egypt during the Exodus. I think it's this word that allowed Joseph to prosper, even though he was accused of a crime he did not commit and put in prison. I think this is the word that when Esther needed to approach the king, God gave this word to her, and she, instead of getting killed by the king like she legally could have gotten killed by the king gives her a favorable response. This is the word that Nehemiah is desperately to see happen in his situation if he's thinking about building or rebuilding Jerusalem. This is the word that as you and I pursue the vision that God gives us for our own lives, for our church, for our relationships, this is the word it's going to take. The word is favor. Specifically, God's favor. I pray this, our church, the one thing that I prayed for more than anything else, more than people to show up, more than small groups to do well, more than the right staff to come on board, more than for all of you to be here, what I've asked God for, and I believe God birthed our church in his own favor. When I'm desperate to see stay with us, things are going to change. We know that, right? We're not in the same facility we started. We started with 1 service. We're now doing 3. We've got small groups in the city. We've got them north of the city, east of the city. We're headed towards the south of the city to start some other ones. So we know that nothing's going to stay the same in regards to those kinds of things for our church. But what I'm desperate, what I'm praying for, what I want God to make sure stays the same is that his hand of favor stays on our church. If there's one word that you can pray for your life, for your business, for your relationships, for your family, for our church, for your city, I think it's God's favor. Favor. The favor of God, because the favor of God can take the impossible and make it possible. The favor of God can do what resources can't do. In fact, you and I, as we begin to pursue things and we think it takes these 20 things to make whatever it is happen, if you have all of those things but you're missing the favor of God, I think you're going to miss it. But if you don't have all of those things but have God's favor on you, I think you and I can actually experience things. So when we think we need this, that, and the other, my hope is that throughout this morning, you'll begin to think, okay, oh, I need this more than that. I need God's favor on my marriage more than I need a good marriage book, though marriage books are great. I've got some aren't so great, but I've got a few, right? I need God's favor more than I need to learn the latest leadership techniques for growing a church in an urban setting. I need to learn those things, but more than that, I need God's favor. The thing that you see all throughout the scriptures wasn't who had the most resources. It was who had the hand of God on their life. Those are the things, those are the people, those are the scenarios that we look back and go, wow, that is amazing. And the reason it's amazing, not because of what the people had, but because of who they had and how they had his favor all over their lives. And so that's what we're about this morning. Last week, Will kicked off this series by letting us know what was on the heart of Nehemiah and began to bring you into the discussion. Hey, what has God put on your heart? In fact, as I read the story of Nehemiah, I invite you to read this. I've just been reading through, just finishing the book and going back over it. And what I see all throughout this book is Nehemiah using a phrase like this: this is what God put on my heart to do. Sometimes he would say, hey, I had not told anyone yet what God had put on my heart to do. And so it's become a prayer for me. And I would love to invite you to begin praying this for your own life. Here it is. God, would you show me what you've put into my heart to do? Would you show me? I have a lot of ideas about what I think is next for my family. I have a lot of ideas about what I think is next for our church. But I'm just praying this, God, would you bring clarity? Would you show me what you've put on my heart? Because here's one thing you can know for sure. Whatever God puts into your heart, at some point, he's going to bring out into your life. If you follow it, if you pursue it, if you go after the vision that God's given you, whatever he puts into our heart, he doesn't just put things onto our heart for us to develop theories about it, okay? That's real safe, though, isn't it? Like, man, if I could just get this, then that would be awesome. And we just think about it. We just think about it. But whatever God puts on our heart, he wants to eventually bring out into our lives. And so if there's something tugging on your heart, if there's something stirring, before you wish it away, before you go, oh, that can't happen for me because I don't have what it takes, just know that if God's stirring something in you, in your heart, he's going to want to bring it out into your life. This is how Nehemiah begins the process for accomplishing what God wants him to do. Another thing I want you to know that is in chapter 1 of Nehemiah, it starts off by giving us a time frame. And what it says is in the month of Chislev. Now, that's not on my calendar. Maybe it's on your iPhone. I don't know. But Chislev has to do with November, December. So keep that in mind. When all the things that Will talked about last week, when those things were going down, it was November, December time frame. And so Nehemiah hears this, man, Jerusalem's in trouble. God begins to birth this vision and download a vision into his heart. And then when you open up chapter 2, it's going to tell us that it's the month of Nisan. Now, know this. Nisan means March, April time frame. And so here's one of the main key points that you and I need to get as we consider and as we pursue the vision God gives us for our lives. Most of the big visions that are God-sized visions are going to take much more time and take more steps than things that are not. Okay? Nehemiah feels the weight of this. He begins praying. He's feeling it. He is mourning. He's weeping. He begins to fast, go without food so he can hear from God and see what God's putting into his heart. But then he waits 4 months before he ever acts on it. Now, we're ready to go today, right? God gives us something, it's time to do it today. And when we have that posture, when we think, okay, I hear something from God, we think that automatically means that today needs to be the day that it's taken care of. But Nehemiah waits 4 months because the bigger the vision is, the more steps, the more pieces of the process. And to be honest, I think process is a cuss word. I would rather it just be done today. I know the rest of you are awesome at patience. Your pastor isn't. Right? And so, but the bigger the vision. So check this out. When we were starting this church, God begins to download the genesis of this church we now sit in my heart, November 2008. We launched the church, as many of you know, in February 2011. 27 months went by before this thing got off the ground. And believe me, there were many, many days where I'm just like, God, why aren't we there? Why aren't we doing it now? The city needs to be reached. The city needs a church like Epic. But now that I'm on the other end of it, I look back and I'm like, I'm so glad we didn't short circuit the process. We're not a perfect church, but I believe the health of our church is the health of our church because we were willing to take the steps. So often what happens is you and I get this big vision from God, and because it can't happen immediately, we give up on it and we go for something that can happen immediately. Some of you have just really whisked away God's dreams and God's vision for your life because it's just so huge. So here's what we do. The vision's huge. We don't want to wait. We don't want to play out the process. We don't want to go through the proper steps. And so we'll pursue something that doesn't take too long, and we can accomplish maybe overnight or close to overnight. And let me just invite you, hey, don't give up on this. If it seems impossible, because here's what you can do, though. You can't take the step like this size today. You can take this step. And the next season, you can take this one. Sometimes God may do it overnight, but as you look throughout the history, really, of how they are freed from slavery, as you look throughout the history even of our own church here, what you see is that the bigger the vision, thousands maybe of steps that it's going to take. And so what you're prone to do, and I know you because you're like me, we get real impatient because we're not so awesome at patience. We get real impatient, and what we do is we're like, oh, that's just too big of a vision. Let me do something that I can, because we like our bite-sized pieces of work, and we love to accomplish things, don't we? We don't rest well till the to-do list is checked off. But when the vision's like this, you're not going to go to bed most nights with it checked off. But what you can say is, hey, have I taken the next step? Have I done the next thing that God asked me to do? Have I done the next thing? And here's what's really cool. If you keep taking the step, even if it's 1,000, if it's 10,000 steps, if God's favor's on it, guess what? There'll come a day when it gets completed. There'll come a day when the vision becomes a reality. Don't give up on the dreams God has implanted in your heart just because it doesn't take place immediately. Nehemiah, he feels it, he owns it, he's praying for it, and then he's finally going to do something about it. And if you know anything about the story, what he's got to do now is get permission from the king. He's cupbearer to the king, which means if the king doesn't grant him permission, it doesn't matter what the desires are in his heart. It doesn't matter how much he wants to go pursue these things. If the king doesn't get him permission, then he's not going to be able to leave his post. All right? He's asking for time off. So let's see how the story unfolds in Nehemiah chapter 2. If you need a Bible, would you just raise your hand? We've got great volunteers walking down the middle that would love. Just keep your hands up high. They'll make sure that you get one of those Bibles. The rest of us, you can turn to Nehemiah chapter 2. It sits between the books of Ezra and Esther, Old Testament. Scriptures will be on the screens as well. But I want you to begin thinking about what is it that you sense God may be putting in your heart, and to begin to process it by looking through the lens of what could this look like if God's favor was on it, if God's compassion was on it, if God's mercy was on it, if God's presence was involved in this thing. Because here's what I believe. Any God-sized thing that you and I are going to pursue, if we don't have God's favor, good luck. If we don't have God's favor, I might even say, give up. Because if God's favor isn't on it, it's destined for failure. Even if it seems easy, even if it seems like if we can just get these 6 things, it'll be successful. If God's hand isn't on our lives, I think we're going to futilely attempt to see things come to fruition. So Nehemiah chapter 2, would you guys stand with me? Page 255, if you received one of those gift Bibles. And so as we look at how this played out in his life, I want you to continually ask, what's my thing? What am I pursuing? What do I need God's favor for? Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. In the month of Nisan, remember that's March, April-ish, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence, and the king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart. Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Then the king said to me, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. And the king said to me, with the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone, and when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy. And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. You may be seated. I think there's so many rich things in this text. I think there's so many things for you and I to grab onto as we begin to consider, okay, I see what God's up to in Nehemiah's life. What principles can we extract? What similarities can we pull? And I think there's so many. The first big idea that I see happening for Nehemiah and I want to implore you towards is this: do not let fear keep us from moving forward to accomplish God's vision. Do not let fear keep us from moving forward to accomplish God's vision. Here's the point I didn't just give you. I didn't say, hey, get rid of all the fear ASAP. I think maybe the church culture that I grew up in was that, man, if you were a good Christian and you were doing things the right way, then you wouldn't have any fears. But really, you look all throughout the scriptures all the time with really strong people. You've got angels and other people showing up going, hey, don't be afraid, right? The angel shows up to Mary. She's all of a sudden just chilling, hanging out, being a teenager. And then the angel's like, hey, you're going to give birth to the Son of God. Freaks her out a little bit, right? But before he even says that, the angel says, Mary, do not be afraid, because fear is the natural inclination. I think so often we think, well, I would only do that if I was no longer afraid. As we begin to start this church, one of the questions that was on my mind and heart that my wife Shauna and I discussed a lot was, hey, what would we be willing to go for if we weren't afraid? Not meaning that fear was going to subside, not meaning that fear was going to be removed, but we just begin to ask ourselves the question, if fear would go away, what would we go after? What would we pursue if we weren't afraid? And as we begin to really approach what we're doing at this church now through the lens of that question, it's not that there were no fears. Let me be honest with you. If fear had to go away for us to move out here and start this church would still not exist. So many of us think, well, I can't move forward unless the fear subsides. We had tons of fear when we moved here. Tons of fears. I mean, we don't know what kind of school the kids are going to get into. We didn't know if anyone would come with us out here. We didn't know if we'd have the money that it takes. If you hadn't noticed, it's expensive to do anything in the city, including church. All right? Just so you know, the church doesn't get a pass in the city. We don't we can't pay our rent. We're a church. That doesn't work well. And we don't want to be that kind of, but there are all these fears. What if, of course, the ultimate church planter's fear is what if, like, it's me and my family that first day? Because to be honest, if you had guaranteed me success, if you had guaranteed me the stories that have unfolded over the last year and a half or so, it would have been real easy for me to do this, right? Some of you are like, Ben, if I could just get promised success, I'm on it. Ben, if I knew my business that I feel like God might be calling me to start that's going to help people in this country or in this city or this situation, I would be all about it, right? Wouldn't you? How difficult is it to go after things that have been guaranteed to be successful? But that removes faith. Don't let fear keep you. Nehemiah is just real honest. What does he say? What's the last sentence he says at the end of verse 2? Not rhetorical. What's the last thing he says? I was... Can we get that up there? Apparently, I'm the only one that's looking at this, and I'm not even looking. He said, I was very much afraid. Was Nehemiah afraid? Let me give you the exact quote. I was very much afraid. Was Nehemiah afraid? We're getting somewhere. Did his fear keep him from moving forward for what God had for him? The question isn't, are we going to be afraid when God calls us to something that seems impossible? Of course we're going to be afraid. The question is, will that fear keep you from moving forward? You know, one thing that just helped practically for our family is that I developed a fear that was even greater than the fears that we had in starting this church. And here's the overwhelming fear that we developed, that for Sean and I, this was just it. There was a greater fear that we would get to the end of our lives, we would look back, evaluate what our life had been about, and that we would be able to say, you know what, we never really went for what we thought God was leading us to do. And what we begin praying early on in this process is that fear would supersede all the other fears in our life and that we would be driven by that. So when it gets easy to stay right? When it gets easy to do something and it's really hard to do the thing we think we should do, that we'd be willing to go, hey, we don't want to get to the end and have regrets. We're not getting it perfect, but we just want to make sure that we're a church, that we're a family, that we have a marriage, that we are moving forward, always going, hey, is fear holding us back? And this morning, if fear is holding you back, let me just release you from something. Even with the fear that's going on in your life, if God's favor is present, if God's favor is the mark, if it's the thing that's distinguishing you, move forward in faith. Move forward. Go for it. Go for it. Listen, if you're worried about there not being enough status quo people, if you quit living status quo lives, there's going to still be plenty of people that are, okay? If you're worried about that pool drying up of status quo individuals in our lives who pursue status quo things and settle, their whole life really is about settling. It looks like they're advancing and stuff, but they're always pursuing and going after things that seem really safe, comfortable, obvious, and make sense, logical sense. There's a reason they call it the average. There's a reason they call it status quo, but what I see all throughout the Bible, what I see in some of my heroes in the faith, both in the scriptures and even in real life, they're men and women, boys and girls who said, you know what, we're going to go for it. We're going to believe that God can do the impossible. We're going to believe that if it's never been done before, that doesn't matter. We're going to believe that even if I don't have the education for it or the experience for it, we're going to go for it. They're going to believe that it doesn't matter what the geographical boundaries are. It doesn't matter what the lifestyle that I have to live up to. We're going to go for it. And I just think there's something to be said if we become a church that pursues the heart of God, that goes after the things that seem impossible, because I do believe if God's favor is in our lives and if it's on the pursuits that we're pursuing, what else do you need? May this be the thing that distinguishes us. This is the thing that Nehemiah is longing for. This is the thing that he wants. He needs permission from the king. He needs the king to do something. Look at verse 4. The king gives Nehemiah the question that we all want, right? If you're looking for a first date, if you're looking for a job, we want the person in charge. We want the person with the power, with the veto power, to ask us what we want and then do something about it, right? What are you requesting? Does Nehemiah know what he's going to request? Absolutely. He's had 120 days to think about it, right? Right? If you've ever rehearsed that question for a boss or for a first date, we all know the question, right? We're not unclear about what we want. He knows what he wants. Then why doesn't he just answer Nehemiah right away? See it in the text, verse 4. The king said to me, what are you requesting? And here's the response. So I prayed to the God of heaven. King says, what do you want? I don't answer him right away. Nehemiah's not praying because he's not asking God, what should I ask him for? What should I ask him for? Do you know what he's asking God for, I think? God, I need you to be in this. God, I need you to do something in his heart. God, I need you to make him lenient towards me. I need you to give him favor, give me favor with him. Listen to what Proverbs 21:1 says. I love this verse. Just discovered it this week. It says, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. And he, the Lord, turns it wherever he will. What does it mean? If you need permission or favor from a human being or from an organization, even if those individuals don't know, worship, or care for God, God still, in his sovereignty and in his authority, is able to twist their heart so that they give you the very thing that you need to accomplish God's purpose. This is a very freeing principle for me, because all the time I think about, when we think about, what buildings is our church going to be in the future, and will the city allow it, and will we get to this or that, just reading this and going, you know what, if God's favor is on us, if we're pursuing what God's asked us to pursue, it doesn't matter who stands in our way. God is able to take men and women who care nothing about him and turn their hearts so that they become favorable towards us. Let this free you. Because what I tend to do, what you might tend to do, is we see people in the way of the vision, we go, they would never go for that. So we don't make the ask. It's very unlikely on the surface that the king would allow his cupbearer just to go off to another country for a while. Very unlikely. But Nehemiah, when the king says to him, what do you want? He pauses and he prays. And I can only imagine he's asking God, all right, this is the moment. I need you to show up. I need you to give me favor. I need you to overwhelm me. I need you to do something in the king's heart. Just like Proverbs 21, I need you to twist the king's heart. Turn it wherever you wish. In order for you to accomplish God's vision for your life, who do you need favor from? Maybe a boss, like you feel like the thing God has for you, you're going to need to spend less time at your job, and you're like, oh boy, he doesn't let anybody spend less time at their job. Do you need favor from a boss and you're scared of that boss and you've played out the conversation a million times that it always ends with you being killed? Right? Like not just fired, killed. Right? You've played it out hundreds of times over. You're like, this is not going to go well. If God's got a vision for you to accomplish, understand this. He's able to overwhelm and overpower the heart of the boss, even if they don't care anything about him. He's able to do that. But for many of us, single people, you're going to get to relax here for a second. For many of us, what we need is the favor of our spouse. Because when we went into the marriage, we promised our spouse that we were going to work in one industry for all 40 years. We were going to live in one place the entire time. And all of a sudden, 10 years into the marriage, God starts doing something in your heart, ladies. You come home, it's late at night. You've played out the conversation with your husband 100 times, and it doesn't always end with him killing you, but never ends well. He's watching SportsCenter, and you're like, hey, we need to talk. He's like, all right. And you're like, this is going to involve a career change. He's like, that's great, as long as you'll just make the same amount of money you're making right now. That's awesome. And she's like, but I won't. Power off. You told me you were going to be this career for your entire life. I see this happen all the time in marriages. Because everything's going along like normal. And what you agreed to, because we always think the man or woman's going to stay exactly the same, right? They all change. We all change, okay? So you better be grounded in that commitment because every one of us change. But you assume that you were going to live at this lifestyle, that he or she was always going to do that, and all of a sudden they're going, hey, God's starting to do something in my heart. And let me just say this. If you're the spouse that receives this word from your husband, from your wife, be very careful that you don't find yourself opposing what God wants to do in their life. Say it again. Be very careful that you don't find yourself opposing what God wants to do in their life. Now, at the end of the day, no matter how grand their vision is from God, they need to put some food on the table. I get that. But do not think that it isn't possible that sacrifice will have to be made, maybe in some way or another. Geographical sacrifice, time, standard of living usually will be one. And that happens. When I was in college ministry as a college pastor, I'd have all the time students whose parents were paying for their tuition especially, or they wanted them to follow in their father's or mother's footsteps to be a doctor, a lawyer, whatever. And they would sense God calling them maybe to another country, a third world place to go and be a missionary. I'll never forget those agonizing conversations because the student would be saying, I know I'm supposed to honor my mom and dad, but I feel like God's calling me to do this. And my parents are giving me this lesson about, hey, we paid for your education. You're going to do this and you're going to like it. And it's just so sad to me because all the time, the people who should be influencing us the most to pursue what God has for us oftentimes become the opposition to what we want to pursue. That's what the whole message next week is about. All of us, just a little tidbit for next week, but you still need to come for the rest. Next week, the whole idea is that anytime you and I pursue what God has for our lives, there will always, always, always be opposition and challenge and criticism. Always. Unless you pursue something that makes sense to everyone, which it won't if it's a God-sized thing. Who do you need favor from? Maybe you need favor to accomplish God's vision for your life. You need some venture capital favor. I'm not saying the guy or the woman or the company will say yes, but I am saying that God has the ability to turn their heart to say yes. Now, still go in prepared, okay? Don't get to the meeting like, hey, show us your business plan. Well, I just feel like God's favor is on my life. Don't do that. Don't do that. Have a plan. Make it very colorful. Don't weight them down with tons and tons of paragraphs. Highly visual. Anyway. But God can't turn their heart. Some of you singles are trying to pursue someone right now, and this is your number one prayer after hearing this morning. God, would you please turn her heart towards me? I know it's highly unlikely, but if you can do it for Nehemiah with the king, it's not a bad prayer. I have no promises on how that's going to be answered. I'm just saying that's not a terrible prayer to pray, but he gets permission from the king. He gets permission from the king. Now, what is it? Like, if you could see anything come about in your own life, what would it be? I don't mean selfish things that are for you, your pleasure, make much of you, but what are the things that maybe God's prompting you to see something change in or a new reality come about? What are those things? sometimes it's very difficult to know what those things are. So let me just give you a couple of criteria, I think, for what these God-sized kind of things are. I really think two common threads. One is that it will be a situation where God can get much glory out of it. Much credit, much fame, much recognition. So God puts us in place. He gives us God-sized visions. And when those things get accomplished, no one can look back and go, man, that human being was awesome. No, we can only go look back and go, you know what, only God can do it. So something where God gets a lot of credit, glory, and the other thing where the lives of others are impacted. All throughout the scriptures, that seems to be the common theme for people that pursued and saw their vision that God gave them become a reality, where people that wanted to live for God, wanted to make sure He got the credit, and wanted to make sure that in the process that there were eternal implications for the people who were involved, both here on this earth and in the life to come. And I get it, it's tough. One of the number one questions I get from people in our church right now is, hey, Ben, I work in technology. I don't understand how that's going to have internal consequences. Or, Ben, I do this. And I just want to say, listen, God can use you in that. He can give you something outside of that. He can give you something instead of that. But I believe that God can use anything. He can use any skill set. He can use any experience, any education. He can use anything that He wants to. The question is, don't count anything out. Who cares if it's never been done before? Who cares if you've got to sacrifice your standard of living? If you and I can be involved in what God has for us, I promise you there's nothing more joy-filled and fulfilling than that thing. I promise you. Sometimes we have to decide, what is it we really want? And that will determine what we're really willing to go after. I remember really the genesis of this church, just seeing so many amazing things happen, praying for favor. Listen, our church is going to change, but the one thing I pray doesn't change is the favor of God resting on our church. When we started, we were in another building and we had one service and we had 4 small groups. And that's not our reality today, and why everything is going to continue to change in our church. The one thing I pray will be consistent and constant is God's favor. Because if God's favor shows up, then, you know what? Do we need good teaching? Yeah, we probably need a lot better teaching. Do we need effective small groups? Do we need to learn leadership gifts and skills? Yes, we're going to do all those things. Do we need great children's ministry? Yes. But more than needing all those things, what you and I need, what our church needs, what our relationships need, is the hand of God on our lives. If you get that, it'll be okay. So Nehemiah, getting back to his story, he gets permission from the king. Remember, he was very much afraid, but he doesn't stop with his permission, does he? He gets permission. Most of us will be like, thank you, and I'm out the door, right? Nehemiah is very much afraid. He gets the permission of the king. Then he's like, oh, by the way, now I need you to use your influence, big boy. Right? So he doesn't just get permission. He wants his influence. If you look at verse 7 and 8, you'll see it. He's like, I need a letter so that I might pass through these people. And then he said, hey, I know you've got that big lumber yard. Verse 8, if you'll check that out, little paraphrase. He's like that guy Asaph, the guy who's the keeper of the forest. I need him to give me some lumber. I need him to give me some timber. And sometimes what we want is just a little bit of favor, and we don't go the full step in asking for those individuals to leverage the influence that they have. Do you know there's a good chance, and I'm not saying that you and I start going up to people in our church and doing this. We are not going to become that place. But there's a good chance as our church is growing and as I learn so many people that do so many amazing things and have resources and have relationships and networks. Do you know there's a good chance that there's someone in our church that could be the missing piece between you and the vision God wants to accomplish in your life? But if you come in after the service starts and you leave before it ends and you don't join a small group, there's a good chance the person, like you're going, I just need to meet the right person, but you're not having your eyes open, you're not making the most opportunities. There's a good opportunity. There's a good chance that the person that you could use their influence from. Now I realize as a pastor, I know a lot more stories maybe than you know of our people, but I'm just telling you, God can use the influence. I'll never forget, there's a pastor in the Bay Area who really has poured into my life and really taught me a lot about church planting and strategy and things like that. And I'll never forget, I made the big ask. I felt a little foolish, but I asked for his influence. He had a relationship with a large church in Dallas, Texas, who was supporting him. And I just said to my friend, I said, hey, would you mind introducing me to that church? Didn't know what would happen. Certainly I'm praying for some pretty big miracles. And so he gets me connected to that church. I meet the church one time, and then I fly out here with the pastor and the missions pastor from that church, in a huge church, about 10,000 people on a weekly basis. And I'm flying on an airplane. My idea is that I was going to show this pastor our area here in Soma and be like, hey, don't you want to do something about it? But before we ever landed in San Francisco, I got up, I used the restroom, came back, sat down. I'm on the window. He's on the aisle. The missions pastor's in the middle. He says, hey, Ben, I just want you to know that our church is going to give you guys over $100,000 to start Epic. Now, may God have arranged that some other way? Absolutely. But my friend who had the influence with this church was willing to leverage it. If I'd never asked, If I just been like, oh, that's too much to ask. Sometimes we don't just need permission and favor from people. We need to ask God and then ask people to use the influence that they have to help us accomplish what it is we need to accomplish. And God will put that on people's hearts. And then you get to the very end of the passage. We'll close here. At the end of verse 8, here's what you might expect the verse to say. It doesn't say this, so this is what we might expect it to say. And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of the king was upon me. That's what I might expect it to say. The king was real favorable to Nehemiah, wasn't he? And it would have been true if Nehemiah had said, the king gave me what I requested because the king's good hand was upon me. That is absolutely true, but that's not what Nehemiah says. He says, the king gave me what I wanted. Why? Because the good hand of my God was upon me. Nehemiah recognized that this was no coincidence. Nehemiah recognized that this wasn't primarily about a good king. I get excited about things falling into place, and sometimes I fail to give credit and go, wait, the only reason that thing happened is because God was involved. The only reason this happens for Nehemiah is because God's involved. The good hand of his God is upon him, he says. I think I want to just give you a couple verses, and this is kind of my life verse, and I would invite you to pray this kind of prayer of favor with me over your life, your relationships, your employment, your church here. Psalm 127, 1 and 2. I love what it says. It says, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. Translation: if God's not in it, it's in vain. If God's in it, you can go to sleep because he's going to accomplish his good purpose as you and I seek him to fulfill the vision that he's put in our hearts. And sometimes we get this so wrong. We believe that God puts a vision in our heart, and then sometimes we think that he's never going to allow us to accomplish it. Remember, what God deposits in your heart, he wants to bring out in your life. He's a God who's for you. Remember Romans 8:31, if God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him give us all things? All things that we need to accomplish his vision. Now, sometimes he's not going to do it in the way that you and I want him to. Right? My question for you is, if you don't go for the thing that God's putting on your heart, who all is going to miss out? Oftentimes, my staff and I will say this to each other. Can you imagine what we would have missed out on if we had said no? 2 or 3 weeks ago, I got a text from a staff couple. They were eating dinner together, reflecting on what God's doing in their life and in our church. And they just said, hey, thanks for asking us to come along. We can't imagine what it would have been like if we wouldn't have said yes. And last Sunday, I'm over in Uganda and powerful worship, and the pastor's preaching the strong message on how God uses our feet to take us to accomplish his purposes. And then it's a foot washing service. They do this once a year, and we know that. And so I'm feeling a little bit uneasy because I don't want anybody messing with my feet, just to be honest. And so our staff, our team, because we're the guests, they washed our feet first and put my socks and my shoes back on. Like that was really cool that they were willing to serve us in this way. And then the pastor brings a couple of basins over to me, and he's like, hey, I want you to have a station to wash the feet of our people. Remember, there's not 6 people in the room. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And as I'm watching the feet, it seems to me that this might have been what it felt like when Jesus washed the feet of the disciples, just because probably similar roads in Uganda as we're around Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, 20 centuries ago. And it was just powerful. And as I got on the bus for us to go back, the thought hit me again, God, what if we wouldn't have started this church in San Francisco? This isn't just about San Francisco. We've lost some of our best people and are losing some of our best people this summer. We're literally sending people from our church that are moving to Singapore, London, Kenya, Chicago, Washington, D.C., on and on and on. So if you're leaving, just don't tell me. No, I think I can bear it. But you know what? They're not leaving empty-handed. And again, I go back and think, what if we wouldn't have done this? And I think when we get to the end of our lives and we realize what we were willing to pursue and how we went after the vision God gave each of us for our lives, I think we'll be able to say that again. Man, what if we wouldn't have done that? Not about us, but what if we wouldn't have said yes to that thing God was prompting us to do? This morning, what if you don't say yes to the thing God's prompting you to do? But then there's a tragic question that some of us will ask at the end of our lives. I guarantee you, if the trajectory stays the same for all of us as it is this morning, some of us will ask this terrible question at the end of our lives. What could we have seen happen if we had gone for what God gave us? I don't know which trajectory you're on, but I want to plead with you, and I want to encourage you. And I want you to know this church is going to be a church that goes for it as much as we can. Don't be the person that has to ask the question, what could have happened if we would have believed God and went for it and had his favor? Don't ask that question. All throughout history, because people went for it, it really even leads to us being able to sit here this morning. Because Jesus went for it, because God gave him a mission. He said his mission really laid out in Mark 10:45, I believe it is was to serve. He came to serve, not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. An overwhelming mission that doesn't just change our lives, give us abundant life here. He changes our eternity, our eternal destiny, and he can do that for you this morning. But the question is, what if he wouldn't have? The question is, what if Nehemiah wouldn't have? The question as our staff thinks about starting this church, what if we wouldn't have? And the question for you is, what if you don't? What if you don't believe him? What if you don't have his favor? What if you don't go for it? What if you settle for status quo? Who's going to miss out? It won't just be you. I'm going to pray for us. I think my passion's running low, or maybe too high. I'm going to ask Brad to sing just a few lines of the song we sang earlier called Take My Life. And I just want you to reflect. Are you willing to give it to him? For salvation, for reconciliation and the relationship, but are you willing to really lay your life in the hands of God, believing he can do with your life what you can't do with your life? So bold request. But if you don't make this request, what else are you going to live for?